Okay, part 2 on psychotherapy with the narcissist. So the grandiose mask of the narcissist is seen as being stuck in place. It's like completely stuck. And this causes a whole range of problems right at the beginning of therapy. Number one, diagnosis is super difficult. As I talked about in the last video, a person may present with depression or obsessive compulsive disorder is another example that the doctor gave of something that narcissists will come in and they will actually present with. And the third thing was hypochondriasis, somebody who has all these kind of phantom mysterious aches and pains being caused in their body, and then they are going to medical doctors and not getting correct diagnosis. Somehow they end up in psychotherapy, and they're a hypochondriac. And those three were the main presenting problems that this field sees. And then, so the narcissists kind of stumble in under one of these covers, and if it's a good psychologist, they'll diagnose properly and come up with narcissistic personality disorder. They have to be very, very brave in order to maintain this person on a caseload. I mean, unless it's for like experimental or academic research purposes, I really don't understand why any therapist would treat or attempt to treat a narcissist. But number two, the treatment contract. This describes the patient's responsibility and the therapist's responsibility in therapy. And this is one of the hurdles that psychotherapists would have to overcome. And it seems like fairly simple. With a normal person, you can get through these things 1, 2, 3, in the first, second session. But with a narcissist, their grandiosity cannot be maintained when they're in reality. So basically, they must be out of reality in order to keep their grandiosity. They have to keep their grandiosity in order to keep everything else in place, or they will crumble. So basically, they need to walk around outside of reality. The patient will have a cavalier attitude, like, why should I accept this contract? Why should I agree? Why should I submit to your contract? Using these kinds of words like submit. Very oppositional. Refusal to agree to a simple contract of therapy. I mean, it's pretty much, routine. But they'll give the therapist a hard time, send them back out and, to devalue mode. Then the doctor did mention, this was just his term. He mentioned a thin-skinned versus a thick-skinned narcissist. He was describing a thin-skinned narcissist as someone who lives in isolation, who's more fragile, versus a thick-skinned one who has a really hard that outer shell, and it's really impenetrable. So sometimes when we're describing the narcissists in our life, we will see this distinction as well. So he gave an example of a 50-year-old woman who came to his office, and she was definitely very eccentric, looked like an overt narcissist and acted like one, and I can't remember what he said her presenting problem was, but she did agree reluctantly to scheduling appointments, and all of this is a put down for a narcissist to even have to schedule a regular appointment. They're going to resist every step of the way. Any kind of movement is going to cause all this fear and resistance in them, that they're submitting or somehow that they're letting somebody get something over on them, so they're not going to cooperate. But this woman was talking about getting a new job, and or a job at all, because I don't think she worked. And the therapist was happy for her and said, "Oh, that's great," and she talked about how the next day she had an interview with the vice president of some corporation, and then the following day a second interview, and was going to go up into this high-rise building, and this woman came in, wearing furs and very decked out for her appointments. And so she came back and she told the therapist that she had gotten the job. He asked her more about what the job entailed. And she said something like she goes into work in the morning, and then she goes to a meeting, sits around a table, has a meeting, and takes some notes. And then she goes into an office and makes telephone calls and tells people about the business. And the therapist made a grave mistake. He, had been snowed. He kind of thought that this woman really was getting a kind of a high-powered job, the way she presented herself and all this, meeting with the president of the company. He bought that hook, line, and sinker. And so when she described her job, what it really entailed, kind of like, ground level, secretary, maybe, if anything, he said, "Oh, so you're a telemarketer?" And the woman became so angry with him. He had shattered that grandiose, a grandiose mask or whatever. And, he had disturbed that by, calling a spade a spade. That's what it is telemarketing. She called him after the session, said she was never coming back. And it was because he challenged her grandiosity so early in the therapy. He just relinquished all his ability to work with her at that point, and he gave up. He said he knew he would never win after that, and he admitted, to the whole community that he'd made a grave mistake just by, kind of calling out what her job really was. And this is how, what kind of eggshells you have to walk on. I mean, you think we got to walk on what eggshells when we're married to one or living with one. If you're a therapist, you have to walk on eggshells so goddamn bad with one of these narcissists. I mean, anything you say during that 50 minutes is, possibly going to send them into a tizzy and they'll never come back. So it's like you have to be so careful. It's such a challenge. So the doctor said that you do not want to say anything that disrupts that grandiose mask, and do not challenge their control. That it's a task just to get them to agree to submit to come to a regular schedule of therapy once a week. That is just like pulling teeth. So he mentioned that so many borderline personalities and narcissistic personalities are being taken care of by others, and he recommended that no one put them on medical disability because they're not disabled, and that they're a drain on society. They won't take jobs, mainly because they think everything's beneath them, and that those personality disorders are not, and dependency on family members and spouses, girlfriends, boyfriends, the system, are not good for them. It's not good for them or for anyone else in society. So he mentioned that. Now, at the lower level of the narcissistic personality, the more serious, the more non-treatable would be as they move toward the antisocial personality disorder. He said those are the hardest because they're above the rules and regulations. As we know, they're dishonest. In order to start therapy with them, these psychotherapists were recommended to enlist a third party to contract and report back, like a family member or a spouse, to confirm their compliance and confirm some of the agreements that the therapist and the narcissist make in therapy, because they just can't be believed. They needed a third party outside of the therapy session to kind of like touch base with, to make sure they're not kind of totally getting snowed over. And that's really hard, you know. Somebody comes to therapy, you know, it's like your lawyer, you're supposed to be honest with them, but no, not a narcissist, and an antisocial one, never. The treatment situation the narcissists have is the typical transference patterns. Okay, so he's talking about the treatment situation with narcissists, and he said that narcissists have certain kinds of typical transference patterns. Number one, here's the things to be aware of. Number one, they want the therapist to be their audience and to admire them. So therapists need to be aware that, you know, they're not just sitting there listening to the narcissist pontificate about themselves. They have to know how to deal with being devalued, because they will get treated as an object, and they'll have to know how to deal with that and try to kind of go gray rock and stay neutral. That the narcissist projects their envy onto the therapist constantly, so that's a total uphill battle to try to get through, and I'm sure it continues on and on. It's not like it gets better, because the narcissist, you know, if they are to ever get better, it's definitely a slow process. The key would be to use how they see you and let them project, and then make some kind of rebuttal to it. So, one example, the psychotherapist said that he was, you know, told on and on that, you know, he was a shitty therapist. He didn't know what the hell he was talking about. He wasn't doing shit for anybody. You know, the Better Business should be called. You people, you know, are just raking in money, and, you know, what do you care if I get better or not? You know, you just want your money and all that kind of bull. And that the psychotherapist said, you know, it must be pretty horrible to have such an incompetent therapist. That kind of stopped the narcissist in their tracks, and that would be kind of like a possible breakthrough moment where the narcissist is able to see that, you know, he wasn't meeting resistance. The therapist isn't denying that he's incompetent or arguing with him or resisting, but he's basically just agreeing with him and then sympathizing about how the narcissist must feel to have all these incompetent people around you. And it kind of opens up a little bit of a door, I guess. The goal was supposed to be so that the narcissist could see that he could have a grandiose self, and he can also have other parts of himself that aren't all so perfect, and it was also okay. It was like you could coexist. So like the therapist could be good and the therapist could be incompetent. The therapist didn't have to be perfect. The therapist could be many different things all at once. They could all coexist. It didn't have to always be all just everything black or white, that everything's actually gray, and that you can get comfortable with that you can accept that. The goal is to get the patient to know their grandiose self without directly challenging it. We are either devalued or we're either devalued or someone who will exploit them. So the patient, you know, is either devaluing or accusing the therapist always of exploiting them. It's easy to, one of the dangers of the therapy sessions is dismissing the patient, because they dismiss the therapist so often that it's hard to resist just feeling like blowing them off and dismissing them. Okay, I'm going to end here.